Join me today as we study the ninth period of Bible history known as the period of the divided kingdom. Thank you for joining me today as we talk about this ninth period of Bible history, the divided kingdom. Last lesson, we talked about the United Kingdom and the kingdoms of Saul and David and Solomon. And so today we're going to talk about what events took place that divided the kingdom. And that's where we're focusing today. Solomon's son was Rehoboam. And when you start reading, or you can read about this in 1 Kings chapter 12. So basically, when his father died, he became king, and he wanted to ask his father's advisors what he could do to be a good king. And they told him, your father was a good king, but he was pretty tough. He taxed severely, so why don't you release some of the taxes and the people will love you. And then Rehoboam also went to his younger friends, people his age, and asked them the same question: what can I do to be a good king? And they told him, you should just be tougher. Let them know who's in charge. And so he listened to his younger friends rather than listening to his father's older, wiser advisors. And when he told the people he was going to be even tougher than his father, then basically they rebelled. A man named Jeroboam led an insurrection. And so it had been prophesied that this would happen, that God would give him 10 of the tribes under his kingdom. And that's what happened. In 1 Kings chapter 11, it was prophesied, and then these chain of events took place and to give Rehoboam this opportunity to be the king over these 10 tribes. And those 10 tribes are referred to from here on out as the northern kingdom of Israel. The capital was Samaria. And so a little bit of tedious information and something that I'm not sure I understand completely. Maybe you have some insight on it. If you do, let me know. But I'm not sure what happened to the tribe of Simeon, because Simeon, if you're looking at a map, is surrounded by Judah. I'm not sure if Simeon, I know that there's a couple of things that may be going on with Simeon. So either they are just so small, they had been kind of taken over by, just engulfed by Judah, or a lot of those people left because of that, because they didn't have a lot of land. They were living elsewhere. And so maybe just physically, the tribe of Simeon, they were already in the northern parts living. I don't know that if you count the two half tribes of Manasseh, you still end up with 10 tribes without even counting Simeon. So it could be that, and then Simeon's basically just not even counted at all. Maybe that's a possibility. I don't know. But the main thing is that the tribe of Judah and Benjamin followed Rehoboam. And they were called the southern kingdom, and they're called the kingdom of Judah because of the tribe of Judah. And so Jeroboam, who becomes that king of Israel, the northern kingdom, he is not a good king at all. He changes everything about the worship. He changes the object of the worship. He makes golden calves for them to worship. He changes the time of worship. The Day of Atonement is another day that's not prescribed by God in Leviticus. He also gives a priesthood. He makes a new priesthood that's not from the tribe of Levi like it was commanded. And also the place. He doesn't want his people going back down to the southern kingdom and worshiping in Jerusalem like they've been commanded to. So he makes all these changes so they can stay up in the northern kingdom. And so he is really he's just rebellious. He's not following God at all. And he just sets a bad example for the rest of the kings of Israel that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. So the period of this divided kingdom, the time period, it would have been around 922 BC up until about 721 BC. So roughly 200 years after the time of Solomon's reign, where Rehoboam, his son, took over and the kingdom divided. That's about 200 years. And the northern kingdom of Israel had a capital of Samaria, and the southern kingdom of Judah had a capital of Jerusalem. Now, this is really important because if you're reading and studying the Bible, you're going to hear about these kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah. And when this, we've always heard about Israel because Jacob's name was changed to Israel, and God's people are called the nation of Israel. And even today and later on in the Bible, Israel is a poetic name for God's people. So you'll see that a lot in books of prophecy, and it might not necessarily always be talking about the nation of Israel that we're talking about right here, but just God's people in general. But so this time period here, after you have the kingdom divided, you have a set of kings for Israel and a set of kings for Judah. In fact, I'm going to link to a chart that lays those kingdoms out and how long each king reigned and in Israel, and then it lays out how long each king of Judah reigned. And it also will give you at least an idea of the prophets who prophesied to these certain kings. And we're going to talk about that later, so hold that thought. But because during this time, God is sending prophets to the kings to give them messages from God. That's what a prophet is. He knows the message from God, so very often he can see the future because God has told it to him. And they preach and teach from God to the people. And so they are constantly in and out of these kings' lives by telling them, don't do that, don't do this, or yes, go and fight that battle, or if you don't straighten up, God's going to punish you. So just ran all these messages, and we're going to talk about this even more in just a minute. But the Israel kings, none of them were good. They started out with Jeroboam being such a rebellious king. There's no wonder. They didn't have one king who followed God, not one who even cared to even try to follow God. They were all just evil people, idolatrous kings. They encouraged idolatry in the nation of God's people. But in the kings of Judah, there were a handful who were good, who tried to restore worship, and there were some bad kings in Judah. And so then a good king would come and he would destroy all the idols. He would destroy all of the high places and restore the days of worship and keeping of the Passover and things like that. So there were a handful of good kings. If you have the book, there is a chart that Brother Kaiser has here that talks about all of this. And I'm also going to link to another one. And sometimes, as it is with charts, it's hard to get exact dates because sometimes archaeology is necessary. It's easy. You can follow it somewhat through the Bible. But anyway, so sometimes dates just differ a little bit naturally because, we're talking about ancient times here. So I wanted to talk really quickly about once these kings of Israel, because they were so evil and because they would not follow God, that all along for 200 years, God's sending them prophets, telling them and warning them. And eventually Israel was destroyed by the Assyrian Empire, who was just a secular, not God's people at all, that God used that worldly empire to come in and destroy Israel. They did this in several ways. One is by basically mixing the people with other nations so that they no longer resembled their own unique nation. So you no longer, after they are destroyed by Assyria in around 721 BC, you really don't have Israelites anymore. They are mixed people. This is very important as we move on in later especially to the New Testament time period. We'll talk about that more in several weeks when we have our lessons on that time period. But I just wanted to let you know about how dark the kingdom of Israel was at this point, and that God punished them, and he warned them that he would. Judah is going to have God's favor a little bit longer. We'll study about that more in our next lesson. We're going to talk just a few minutes. I wanted to explain a little bit about how these kings and prophets work actually in the pages of our Bible. So let's talk about how this period of the divided kingdom looks like in the pages of our Bible. I mentioned that you can read in 1 Kings chapter 12, the beginning, how this all started to take place. But all the way through that book, 1 Kings, and all the way through 2 Kings, you'll be reading about this divided nation. Specifically the northern kingdom of Israel or the southern kingdom of Judah. And as you read through there, you'll read that there were certain prophets. The chart I'm going to link to shows you prophets who would come in and prophesy during a certain king's reign. So it's I've already mentioned that's important to have as you read through this time period. But I want to specifically talk about the books of prophecy at the end of the Old Testament. If you're looking at your table of contents, at the starting of the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament, all the way to the end of the Old Testament, all of those books are called prophecy, the books of prophecy. The first 5, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, and Ezekiel and Daniel, are called the major prophets, and the last 12 are called the minor prophets. It's usually only because those first 5 books are long and the last books are shorter, and so that's really the biggest difference in the major prophets and the minor prophets. And so it's just important to realize that those books of prophecy were taking place during this time period. Except for Daniel, and we'll talk about him specifically later on in a couple of more lessons. But so like Isaiah, for example, prophesied during the time of like Hezekiah, and you'll be able to read about him coming in and speaking to Hezekiah, or preaching, telling messages from to the people to warn them about obedience and things like that. So that's just so important to remember. I know I was older before I realized that those books didn't necessarily happen after the kings, that they were happening as the kings are reigning. Prophets are coming in. Now, not all the prophets, I think I mentioned this, not all the prophets who did come in that you can read about in the book of Kings necessarily have their own book of prophecy in the Bible, but very often a lot of them do. And so it's just interesting to study along with the king, the parts that as you read in 1 Kings. It's important to know that it would be a very interesting study to see what Isaiah said during that particular king's reign, and it's very interesting because you get a better idea of the condition of the people and what God was trying to teach them as they were living into this divided kingdom. Now, next week we're going to speak and we're going to study about how Judah, there was a time, 200 years, that they were alone. That's the 10th period of history, the time of Judah alone. So I hope you'll join me next week as we put another piece of the puzzle together